Everyone. Welcome. My name's John. Welcome to this intro to HTML and CSS. This video will be definitely under 2 hours, hopefully under 30 minutes, and I will give you an overview of the following. What are HTML and CSS? Why do we care about them? And then some next steps after learning HTML and CSS. What are some things that you're going to want to do with it and learn next? So here I have a Google Doc. You can make a new Google Doc just by going to docs.new, pro tip. And here I've created an agenda of sorts, but I also want you to look at the way the text and items on this page look, because what HTML does is it allows us to do stuff like this. So HTML means hypertext markup language. And the fact that it's hypertext really means two things. One, it's more than text. So text by itself can never be bold, it can never be italic. But hypertext can be natively bold and italic. And then the other aspect of hypertext is that it allows you to click links to different pages. So ordinary text has no concept of a network, but hypertext allows you to move around the web. The markup language is the syntax that we will use. Syntax is a number of characters. So you can think of ABC, 1, 2, 3, and then symbols like the bracket, the slash, the dot. These are all characters. So syntax is the collection of characters in their particular arrangement that allows an interpreter to understand what you are saying. So in English, I might say, hey, my name is John. But in hypertext, I can say, hey, my name is John. And I can use these additional symbols, including the angle and the B, to tell someone who can read hypertext to make this bold. And who can read this? Browsers. So hypertext is what browsers are for. What does a web browser even do? The main thing a web browser does is it understands and interprets hypertext, and then it can make a visual picture that we can look at. So that everything you see here on this page, whether it's the heading or the subheading or the ABCD, these are basically, you can think of it like a picture that the browser is creating. Chrome is the browser in this case. And of course, there's a bunch of browsers, Edge, and so on and so forth. So where does CSS come into the picture? CSS allows us to do additional style changes to hypertext. So hypertext has some set of features, including bold and italics, but it's a limited set. CSS expands this greatly so that we can have all sorts of colors, red, green, blue. We can do animations. We can do, when I hover over something, it will change. So we cannot do full dynamic HTML. That's going to require something called JavaScript, but we can do minimally interactive HTML by using CSS. All right, and so let's start by just trying to make something that looks like this web page. We're actually going to build something that looks like this web page, and maybe we'll build something that looks like the Google homepage. So here I see a number of things. I have these links in the top left. When I hover, I get an underline. In the top right, there's like a circle with some colors on it. It has a picture of my face. So images are going to be a kind of HTML, and we can do things with them using CSS. Google, it's in all sorts of colors. When I hover over the search bar, I can type into here. Searching itself is not included in HTML, CSS. When I hit enter, that's going to send data over the network and it's going to receive a reply. All of that requires JavaScript. So when we're building a website, it's important to understand the boundary of HTML and CSS. What can it do and what can it not do? And so that's going to give us some foreshadowing where to build a whole website, we're going to want to learn something called JavaScript, and that will not be included in today's course. I also have a footer. So here at the bottom, there's some links again in the bottom. And then that's outside of the browser below it. It's just sort of, I'm on a Windows machine, and that's the Windows taskbar. Okay, so this is the content of our web page. Web page. Also notice what's above the web page. We have this is called the address bar, or the URL, or the address for google.com. Technically, there's this prefix, HTTPS. This is not inside of the page. This is something that the Chrome browser is giving us. So when we write a web page, we're not going to be writing that. This domain name stuff is out of the scope of the web page itself. Cool, so that gives us sort of an overview, some of the stuff that we can do. This little icon, when I click it, it will erase text. That is not an HTML feature. That is a JavaScript feature. So this concept of dynamic HTML, where a user action changes the HTML, that is JavaScript. So you can think of JavaScript as making your HTML interactive. So with HTML and CSS, I can make any sort of artistic picture, but it's going to be like a snapshot. And it can do very limited interaction like hovers and things. Most of the user interaction, where if I touch a button, it changes and things like this, that's a combination of all three technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's dive in. So how should I start to dive in? It's hypertext, so we can start by just making a text file. It really is that simple. So let me go new text file, and I'll say some page. But here's the problem. This actually is just a text file. I can open it with Notepad. Always, I guess. Hey, I am some ordinary text. I'm going to save this, Control S, I'll close it. And let's see what the browser does with this sort of ordinary text. I'll literally just click and drag a file on my computer to the web page, and you can see local files on my computer have an address. So this is on my C drive. And so we can do this. And you see it just says, hey, I am some ordinary text. So a browser can interpret this, but it doesn't give us the stuff that we want. What if I do that bold thing? So I'll save that, I'll close it, and then I'll refresh this page. See, it doesn't render. It puts the literal character here, and I don't want that. I want the browser to interpret it as if it's a foreign language. The way that I do this, notice it says .txt. I'm going to have to change the file extension from text to HTML. That's really all I need to do. One other thing to be mindful of, notice here I said some page in the file name with a space. And in the URL, that got turned into %20. This happens when it comes to file names and put in the address bar, specifically the way browsers work. This is called a URL encoding, and it's a thing that gives developers nightmares. And so I did this intentionally so that I could show you that we want to avoid spaces in your file names, basically. So as you go on in your coding career, you'll notice like there's lots of dashes and underscores and all sorts of things other than spaces. That's very much on purpose. So when we rename this thing, we're going to change the file extension. To do that, we need to reveal file extensions, and then we're going to eliminate the space. One other change while we're at it. Early career programmers, I'll see them creating files just like I did here on the desktop. It's an easy way to get started. But as you're coding more and more, this becomes basically not scalable and not a good way to organize your code. So we're going to want to go ahead and put the code in my personal workspace folder. So this symbol here is the tilde. And when programmers use this tilde, they're using it to refer to the user home folder. So my name's John, so it'll be something /John, whatever. On yours, it'll be different. You may share a computer with a few different people, and there's a few different profiles on that computer, so different people can log in. Each one of those people will have their own home folder. And we like to put it under the workspace folder, which is not technically required. This is a convention. It's something that developers routinely do because it makes talking to other people easier. When I say my workspace folder, everyone knows what I'm talking about. Some people will call it like code or something else or projects. But the idea that is shared but not required becomes a convention to use this workspace folder that's in the users folder. Okay, so how do we get there? There's a couple ways to get there. If I'm on Windows, I could come over here, open up the File Explorer. I could go to this PC, local drive, users, and find John. Okay, and so here I can right click and create a new folder. This is the sort of like Windows Explorer way to do it. There's another thing I can do, which is that I can open in Terminal, and this will work on Windows or Mac, and I can CD tilde, and that takes me to John. So this is really convenient. You can get there really easily. And then here I can make a directory called Workspace, which is just like right-clicking and saying new. Now I can ls, which is going to list what's in that directory. And you see it has this stuff, which is just like what the Windows Explorer would have told me, with one interesting difference. Oh, never mind. So the dot folder here will often be hidden by default, but I guess I've revealed it. Okay. Now, the other thing I can do is show more options, and let's reveal, oh, it's going to be under view, isn't it? Let's reveal the file extensions. So file name extensions, I'm going to show that now. And notice on my desktop there, some page became somepage.txt. I didn't change it. It was already a text file from the moment that I created it as a new file, but now the operating system is showing us that extension. And I can literally just rename it now that I'm showing the extension. If I can remember how to rename, okay. And I can literally just change it to .html. And remember, I wanted to get rid of the space, so I'll do somepage.dash instead of a. I have no idea where it went. Hey, Windows, what are you doing, buddy? Let me go to my desktop, ls here. It's there somewhere. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and remove it, rm somepage. This syntax that I'm doing with the rm and the ls, this is PowerShell. You can see up here, my terminal is Windows PowerShell. Another popular terminal is called Bash. I actually recommend that you use Bash. This is stuff that you can learn way later. You don't need to know it right now. But I'm giving you kind of a preview of some of the stuff that you're going to do. And I'll just give you another preview, which is you don't need to memorize all these things. You're going to have search strategies, which are going to allow you to look up all of these vocabulary. Memorizing is going to be great, but you'll sort of learn over time, and it'll become muscle memory. And don't worry about it if you don't remember, because you can just look it up again. Okay, dot dot, we'll go to the parent folder. The parent of desktop is John, okay? And so now I'm changing the current directory. That's like kind of like double clicking in the terminal form. So now here I am in the workspace, and I'm going to make a file. I don't know if I can use touch here. Somepage.html. Yeah, touch is not in PowerShell. But that's okay. I think I can open this. No. Let's see. I don't know. Let's go over here this way. So I'm going to make a new file. And this is somepage.html. We deleted it off the desktop. I couldn't find it. And look, now it has the Chrome icon. So I'll be using Chrome. You can use a different browser. That's fine. And now I'm going to edit it. We'll edit it with Notepad. Say, hey, this is John. And click and drag over to the browser. This is kind of annoying to have to do all this stuff. It's going to change my page over here, so I better open a new tab. And I'm showing you a lot of the kind of annoying friction points so that later when I introduce you to something called an IDE, you're really going to understand why it's so useful, because it allows us to avoid doing all this annoying stuff. And you see now it's bold. And I could change it. I could add style here and say color :red. And a lot of this becomes like trivia, doesn't it? You just have to kind of know, and now the color there is red. You have to kind of know this style vocabulary. And as I said, you're not going to be expected to remember this stuff, but basically you're learning a language. And so HTML and CSS are languages. When you say that around programmers, they may sort of joke with you because it's not a Turing complete programming language. So a Turing complete programming language can change my computer visual in any way, in any arbitrary way. I can move pixels around. HTML and CSS have a very restricted set of things that they can do. So software engineers sometimes scoff at the idea that they are a programming language, but you can just clarify that they are a non-Turing complete programming language, or you could say that they are a DSL, which is a domain-specific language. That is, they are a language. They have a unique syntax. They require a unique interpreter to execute a unique function, but they're domain-specific. They do a very restricted set of things. In the case of HTML and CSS, the domain that they're restricted to is pretty much websites. You can use them for other things like mobile apps, but typically when we talk about HTML and CSS, it is something a browser is going to read, so it's domain restricted in that way. But it is a programming language. A little bit of trivia for you. Okay. So we've gotten through them, and then what is CSS? CSS means cascading style sheet. So what makes it cascading? So here I've said that, hey, this is John, but I can do something called nesting. Let me make a new paragraph here. So P for paragraph. I'm going to say, hey, no, for real, this is still John. And what you'll notice is that the B tag is red and the P tag is not, right? Are you starting to get it? It's not rocket science. So the style here is red and the style here is black. Now, I can make something called a span here. If you've ever wanted to change the style in the middle of the text, let's say I go to Microsoft, and here you see colors, font styles, and spans. This part of the paragraph looks different. That's what a span is. It's just a section inside of a paragraph that you want to look different than the rest of it. Or up here, the word convention has an italic span. The rest of the paragraph is looking ordinary, but convention has a style or formatting. So this word style really means formatting. These are synonyms in the world of programming. So this particular word is treated as an italic span. Okay, and HTML and CSS, once again, is just letting us do the things that you can do sort of in a Google Docs or in your Microsoft Word. All of these advanced text editing capabilities that are not in plain text, but they are in these advanced text editors. HTML and CSS let us do that and often more. But that's a really good mental model for what do we even care about this stuff? Because for the same reasons that we care about formatting your presentation or formatting your document to have lists and so forth. Similarly, with a website, you will want to have these visual features that allow us to indicate to the user, okay, like this is a list of things, right? When we talk about this in the world of web programming, we call this the structure of your web application. So literally, you're arranging items into a list that's kind of like a structure. It kind of makes an outline, right? And we're going to be able to do the same thing with programs. So, hey, no, for real, this is still John. So the span is a different HTML element, but it's still going to be black. Okay? And what if I tell the paragraph to, you might say, well, it's just black by default. But what if I tell the paragraph to be blue? The span will also become blue. And so this is what we mean by cascading, is that when you have elements inside of other elements, by the way, this span is called an element. You see I have some syntax, which is specifically the left angle bracket, the word span, which is the tag name, and the right angle bracket. This indicates an open tag. And then the entire element is the combination of the open tag, the value of the tag, and the close tag. So this is a span element altogether. The syntax represents an element. And we can do all kinds of stuff with that element in the world of CSS and JavaScript, but from the HTML perspective, this is the text representation of the span element. Okay? So there's the letters on the page, and then there's the thing it refers to. And we're actually telling the browser to go create a little bit of data in the memory of your computer. Whenever we write this text here and the browser reads it and interprets it, it's actually creating a thing that refers to that. And so the paragraph blue is going to cascade down to the span. The span will allow us to override that. So here I can say it's not like it's not overridable, but it's going to cascade down by default. Okay, and so now I've made only the word still green. Okay. Now we know what HTML and CSS mean, and it's cascading style sheets. What is a style sheet? Well, here I've written style in the HTML tag. That's one way to communicate style to the browser. Who are we talking to here? We're using a language to talk to your computer. We're using a language to talk to your browser. One way to do that is with inline style. This is generally considered a bad idea, and the reason for that is, let's say that I have a bunch of things. I have like a bunch of paragraphs. Then one day I decide, you know what? I want to change the font. I don't like this font. It's this Arial style is so boring. I want like Times New Roman everywhere, or I want this cool caveat font. I will have to go change the code in many places. And this refers to a single web page, right? Some page. What if I have a website with like 100 pages? I have to go change all the lines of code, and I could make a typo. So it's more work and it's more risk. The better way to do that is to use something called a class. So here I can say class equals blue paragraph. Or maybe I would say this like, better yet, blog paragraph, so that it doesn't have blue in the name. So that when I decide to change the text on all my website, let's just say I'm changing my blog articles, but I have 100 blog articles or whatever, and I'm changing them from Arial to caveat, I do not have to go into all the web pages. I can change a single style sheet. And so I'm going to show you what a style sheet is. But basically, I will be able to say blog paragraph, and now I'm using CSS syntax. Okay, so I'm using characters that are going to talk using a language called CSS. So it's a different second language that I'm talking to the browser with, but the browser is going to operate on that same object. So the span object, where I said color green using HTML, using CSS, I could maybe say make it italics, and the browser is going to do both. It'll say, okay, it needs to be green and italics, and it will update the picture on the page to do both. So we're speaking to the browser using multiple languages. But in this blog paragraph, I could say font family. This will be the name, and it would be Arial. Okay, that would be the default. And then one day I would go change it to caveat. And I'm just updating one line of code. And that's one of the things developers love, is we love to minimize our changes. Ideally, being as lazy as possible. In programming, lazy is a good thing. If you can knock out your workday early, great. We care about getting the thing done. We don't care about like spamming hours. Okay. So this is not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work, it's not going to work as such is because I've put CSS inside of an HTML file. Let's see what happens when I actually go load the page. Let's go load. Look. You see, it just prints it. It thinks it's ordinary text. When I say it thinks it's ordinary text, I mean the browser thinks I'm writing ordinary text. So what I can do here, and let me make this more apparent. Instead of font family, I will say font weight, and I'll say 800. This is just a number that means like really bold. Oops, I think I messed a thing up. Definitely messed a thing up. Let me go open that file. Edit, open with. Okay. So 800 is just a number for how heavy the text should be. It's like a level of boldness. So you might be familiar with the idea of bold and unbold. Like, look, it's bold, it's not bold. But actually, we can do more than that with HTML and CSS. We can talk about how bold you want it to be, which allows a richer expression of styles of the web page. So you can get more visual variety. It can be more interesting than an ordinary text editor. Okay. And this still doesn't work. Why doesn't this work? So check out what I'm going to do here. I'm going to wrap this in a style tag. So now it is not ordinary text. Now when the browser reads it, it is a style element. And look what happens. It's vanished from the page, and the blog paragraph is now bolder. And here I can add a color. Let's say orange. And we still have the span is overriding, right? But the blog paragraph, which is referred to using this period syntax, is having its style updated. So we're updating the style of the element without using an inline style. That's what CSS lets us do. The main thing CSS is going to let us do is it's another vocabulary that allows us to update the look and feel, the style or the formatting of elements without having to use inline styles. We can use these style tags, and then when I talk about a style sheet, I can actually put this in a completely different file. Okay, so let me try to do that now. So here's somepage.html, and I will say somepagestyle.css. Okay. I'm going to take this out of the HTML. So I've shown you how to do inline style. I've shown you how to use the style element, which allows you to put CSS in the HTML file. But now I'm going to extract it to a totally different file. I'm going to extract the same code. So now we're editing this guy in Notepad. And I don't put the word style here because this is not an HTML file. I just literally put the CSS. So all of this text is CSS syntax. And what happens to our web page? It's not working anymore. Bummer. Well, I need to import the CSS style over here or link it. And now we'll go over to ChatGPT. Hey, let's talk to ChatGPT and say, hey, let's not say hey. Let's say, I would like to import a CSS file called some page what is it? Did I say some page style? What did I call it? Some page style, yeah. Some page style.css into the HTML code below. I'm going to put 3 backticks. This is a pro move. You can even say HTML, by the way. ChatGPT understands when you do the 3 backticks. It understands that you're not speaking English anymore. You're about to put some code. And then I do 3 more to show that that's the end marker. Just like you have the open B and the close B, here you have an open section and a closed section. That's technically markdown syntax. And ChatGPT has given me a bunch of stuff. I could just blindly copy the file. That's not going to be smart. What will be smarter is to actually read what it says, right? To import a CSS file, use the link element. And so I immediately know, okay, it's done all this extra stuff, but really I care about the link element. And it's going to reiterate down here, this is the part that you actually need. So some people, I'll see them just like copy this. That's the wrong thing to do. Read what GPT said. And then you can also just kind of think about if it's reasonable, but this looks pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Like, oh, we want to import it, so a link, yeah, that kind of makes sense. If you're really skeptical, you can go to Google and say like HTML link element. And so you can definitely verify what GPT says if you want to. Really, we want to use ChatGPT as a shortcut for Google so that I don't need to go through all these websites and be like, okay, which one do I believe? What do they say in common? What does one page say that the other, like where are they arguing with each other? ChatGPT will just be taking sort of the average response across the internet. That's its training set data. And we can see that W3 Schools, and I can just tell you because I'm the expert who knows and who's been down this road, W3 Schools is a pretty trustworthy website. And so I could read this and go, well, does this correlate with what ChatGPT said? And the answer is yes. They're both telling us to do the right thing. So here I'll paste this. Now let me go look at what my page is doing. Oh no, it's still not working. What's going wrong? It's assuming a folder called styles that doesn't exist. So let me delete that part. I actually should have caught that. Yeah. So this syntax styles slash, it thinks ChatGPT assumes that we are going to put our style files in a folder called style, which is a common thing to do. We just didn't do it. But now that I've done it, let me refresh the page and you can see it still works. And we'll go over to here. Windows is like, oh no, you moved it. All of these little annoying things, I want you to remember, they will all go away when we start using an IDE. That's a integrated development environment. That is the tool that programmers actually use to write code. We're not using Notepad all day, believe it or not. Okay, so it freaked out and now I need to go to Windows Explorer and open this with in Notepad. And so let's, instead of doing color orange, let's do color red, just to change it and prove that we're capturing the style rules that are written in this folder. And you can see it got updated. Okay, so this is the syntax of CSS. We have a couple rule names here. So font weight is a kind of font style or font formatting that refers to the level of boldness. Here we've dealt with the color. This is the class name of the HTML elements that we are wanting to impact. Let me change the other bold to also have a similar class name. And we'll call this also a blog paragraph. Okay, so I deleted the inline style saying red. I totally just messed up the whole website, didn't I? Sorry. Pop quiz, do you expect this to work or no? It shouldn't work. It shouldn't work. So I've lost my red. And do you know why? Because I've lost that link attribute, or that link tag. So let me go back, copy it again. And now the red is restored. The red is applying to both elements, even though the top one doesn't have the inline style anymore, because it's using that class. And this period is the class selector. So these are some of the things that we've covered so far. There are some other selectors. We can use an ID selector. And so here I'll call this green span, which is going to have a color of, let's make it blue, just to be confusing. We'll call this a special span. Special span. So here's the green span that we had, right? But now I want to use the CSS class. And why would I want to do this? Maybe I have like a bunch of these spans in different paragraphs. Maybe like every blog article has a magic word that's highlighted in green. And so that will use that will use an ID here. Special span. Did I spell special correctly? Okay, special span. And so it should be blue. Cool. So the word still is blue because of this hashtag, which is referring to the ID. So if I try to do class here, it will not apply anymore. It will not apply because the browser is looking for an ID when it finds the hashtag. So this is called a class selector. This is an ID selector. I can also do a tag selector where I don't have any prefix. I just say span. And this is going to select the tag name for all spans. Okay, so let's do a span over here. And this will be class not special. Okay, so even though it's not special, it is still going to get updated. And it's still getting updated because it's still a span. And the CSS rule is looking for a span here. Lastly, I can do attribute selection. So this is the tag name. The class is a special attribute. The ID is also an attribute. But then I can also do random banana. Random banana. How do you spell banana? Equals 10. Okay? And this is just absolute nonsense, isn't it? So this is an arbitrary attribute on the tag. So whenever you have this is called a, so class is a key and then it equals double quotes a value. So it's a key value pair. In HTML, some key value pairs are special or ordinary or routine, like the class and the ID. There's another that's called name. Okay, so these are common and routine, but then you can also make arbitrary ones. You can literally put whatever key value pairs you want within the open tag. It's always going to be in the open tag of the element, not the close tag. Okay, so here I've got random banana equals 10, and I can make a CSS rule that matches to that. Let's see if I can remember this. So I think it's the bracket, random banana, and then I'll do text decoration underline. Let's see if this works. Okay, so you see the word still is now underlined because it has this key name, random banana. And I can go put the random banana on the, and here I can say random banana equals 4. You see I've specified the CSS rule based on the key name regardless of the value, right? And so now the whole thing is getting underlined. You can do other things, like you can have it depending on the random banana value. You could do that if you want to. I'm not going to get into that, but you could just ask ChatGPT, okay? And so we're getting down here pretty well, but just jumping ahead slightly, we are going to have things that are not covered in this course. And the main way to go beyond this course to understand all of this vocabulary is to understand the search strategies. And ChatGPT will be your #1 tool there, but there's a bunch of other tools like how do you Google, how do you identify trusted sources like W3 Schools? What about social networking? I could get help from other people. That's going to be another search strategy. So search strategies here is going to be a general term to learn anything, look up anything, and uncover new things. Like we can include research and science under search strategies. These are all, from the economic point of view, these are all search problems. Okay, so search strategies there is going to be a very, and by the way, that's like a different course. You should totally take it. It's really important. So you can go laterally.io. I'm not sure if I'm logged in. I guess I'm not logged in. All right, let's log in quickly. Right at the top of the checklist is the search strategies, search techniques. So this will be a really great starter for you. This one's totally free. A full course is forthcoming, which will be much more detailed than this. But this search techniques, I think I have like 6 or 7 in here. And that's a really great starting point that should take care of you for now. And you can also join the Discord and get personal help, right? Okay, so we know what hypertext markup language is. It's basically kind of like text with additional symbols that a browser can interpret to do way more stuff than show you ordinary text. It can bold the text, it can underline it, it can make the text larger, so we can talk about the font size, larger or smaller. If you've ever seen, like in a research paper, there's like the little citation where it's like, see reference 1, and there's like a tiny superscript of a 1. You can see how I could just make like a tiny 1 and move it, and that will allow me to generate all these things that we've seen. So probably we should talk a bit about position, about how to move things. So it's a text file, but it's not. It uses file syntax that browsers know how to interpret it. So here we've pretty much been using paragraphs. Let's talk about some other common elements. Again, you don't need to know all of the elements. You can just ask ChatGPT if you're not familiar with a kind of element. And here's a fun thing you can do. You can take a screenshot and ask ChatGPT. And you can ask it, what sort of element or elements should I use in my HTML code to generate let's see, do you actually want to say Google? Let's say to generate the word sandwich in a style or format similar to the way Google is written in the attached image. So you can do attachments with the GPT-4o. Did you know that? And it will give you an example of the HTML and CSS. Here you go. You can see we're changing the font family, the font size, right? So the word Google is larger than sort of the default size on the page. It's coloring each of the letters. Now, here it's given you a hex code for color. And then in parentheses, it gave you the English word. You can actually specify color values in different ways. So here is the color rule. So the rule includes the key and the value. Here is the CSS property name, and here is the rule value of blue. You can also say in double quotes blue if you want to, or you can do a hex code equivalent for blue. You can also do RGB, red, green, blue. And so maybe I say like 0, 0, 100. So it's going to have 0 units of red, 0 units of green, and then 100 units of blue. So this is a shade of blue. And 50 would be a darker shade of blue because there's blue, but there's less of it. It's closer to black. Then there's HSL, HSLA. So there's other ways that you can specify these. And you don't need to know all of them. Like you can go ask, if I'm uncomfortable with a hex code, I could say like, can you just tell me the, the English name or the HSL name or whatever. And GPT will often be able to convert those. And so look what it's done. It made a div with a bunch of spans, a span for each letter, and then it colored them and resized them. And that's a fine way that we could generate this Google bit here. All right, where are we at? Headings. Good, so let's talk about headings next. So we've talked about paragraphs. We know what a paragraph is, right? A span, we talked about a span. What about a list? So here's a list. This is called an ordered list, A, B, C, D, E. And then down here, you can see this is an unordered list. Here's another item of note in no particular order. So if we want to communicate ordering, we are going to use an OL for ordered list. And for the unordered list, we will use UL. And so here, I will make a list item, which is, I don't know, here we'll do an H3, which is cookie recipe. So we'll have a series of steps. What do you want? You want gather eggs. This is not a real recipe, y'all. Please don't use this recipe. Mix eggs, water, flour, and sugar. Bake on 350 F for 20 minutes. I'm like, please don't. I'll be baffled if that produces an actual cookie. Okay, and I'll put it under the unordered list as well. Still a list item, but you're going to see that they will render differently. So you see the ordered list is 1, 2, 3, and the unordered list are 3 dots. Now, what if I want ABC instead of 1, 2, 3? I can alter that using the list style. And here I'll just ask again, ChatGPT, I'll give it this code. Alter the ordered list style so that the items say A, B, C instead of 1, 2, 3. And you can see I don't have to be like super technically precise when I'm talking to ChatGPT. That's like the beauty of using a language tool, is that it can actually understand more or less natural language. You can see the CSS rule that it's telling us to use is upper alpha. Here it's written in CSS, but I know as a developer, if I want, I can go ahead and make that an inline style. Since this is not going to be part of a class, I'm not reusing it. I'm just using it in this one case. Maybe it's arguably fine to put it inline in this case. And now I've got ABC, all capital. Okay? Here I've used an H3. Notice it says cookie recipe in slightly larger, slightly bolder text. This is a level 3 heading. So your headings are your H elements, H1, H2, H3, and it goes up to, I think, 6, 7, or 8, even though we rarely use those. Really, 1, 2, and 3 are going to be the main ones we use. And why would you use these? The main heading is your H1, just like you have in your Google Doc, and then you have subheadings, and you might even have subheadings. And we usually don't go beyond that. One thing to note, your web page should have at most one main title. You should not have multiple main titles. So let me give some H1 on here. Demo page. You can see, without even making any CSS changes, the browser already shows my H1 larger than my H3. So when I choose these different HTML elements, the browser will have default style in mind for each element. We can use that default style or we can override it. That's up to us. But one of the interesting things when we think about HTML, CSS, why do we think about them together? And the answer is to really understand what the browser is even doing with HTML alone, you already need to know some aspects of style in CSS so that the browser is picking style rules automatically for you, and then you can override them if you want. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to box model and rendering modes. We talked about nesting. Oh, divisions. So a division is this word div. And I think this gives us a good example of why you would want to use a div. A div is a generic element that doesn't mean anything. You know the word paragraph? Like paragraph means something. A heading, it means something. Like outside of programming, headings mean things in ordinary English. The div intentionally doesn't mean anything. We call it a non-semantic element. Again, with the OL, an ordered list, that means something, like logically in English. It has a semantic meaning to us. This is an ordered list, this is an unordered list. But what about a div? It just means an arbitrary division or section of the screen. That's all a div is. So the div should not be used to tell the end user anything, because it doesn't mean anything. What you use it for is you use it to move other elements around. So it's a container that you can put things in, and then you can move them around. So it's really useful for getting more space or centering things. So this word Google, it's sort of in the middle of the page, almost vertically and horizontally, right? So how do they do that? Well, they have these letters, and if we look on, let me tell you what I'm doing right now. Right click and inspect. I can look at the HTML and CSS that the Google page is using. So I could just go copy it if I want to. But notice here, and they're using an image, not a span of letters. That's fine. So an image, IMG, is a kind of element in HTML. How do you get a picture into your website? You use this IMG element, and then you give it a source that points to a file. I can just go open that file by itself if I want to. But it doesn't matter whether this is an image or a collection of spans. ChatGPT gave us a collection of spans that ends up with the same picture. Whatever goes inside of this div, now I have a div, which is like a container. Think about like a chunk of Tupperware, and I can move it around wherever I want. Or you can think about like a piece of paper. So when we think about cascading style sheets, you can think about I'm laying pieces of paper on top of one another. And there's this small piece of paper that has GOOGLE, and I can just gently move that thing around, and I'm ultimately making this flat web page, right? So let's change this. Let's change the max height from 92, and now it's moving it up, right? I can click the number 92 and move with my arrow keys. That's cool. Here I'm using position relative. I could say position absolute, and I can pick top 0, left 0. And I'm just talking with the page using various CSS rules. Here I've changed the position strategy to use absolute positioning, which says I don't care where you're nested. So remember, cascading, you will inherit your parent style by default. So this span is nested inside of the B, the bold tag. B means bold text, which is really not a good thing to do because bold is a style or formatting concept. So the better thing to do is to call this a paragraph and then add boldness in your style sheet. And we call that separating concerns. So you put your formatting in your style sheet, keeps your logical concerns clear. What are you doing with your HTML, the structure of the web page? What are you doing with your CSS, the way it looks? Okay. And by default, that word John would always go inside of the paragraph because it's nested there. But if I wanted to, I could use this special CSS rule called position absolute, and then I can just move the word John anywhere I want. Like, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so here I'll say position absolute, and then I will say, by the way, this isn't going to work, and I'll explain why. And I'll say top 0, left 0, which should make it go all the way in the upper left of the page. By default, even if I don't have these rules, when the browser reads your HTML file, it will read it top to bottom, left to right, and it will also render that way. So this is very normal and natural if you're an English speaker. If you're a native to other certain languages, it may be less intuitive, languages which go right to left and so on. But the HTML specification, the way that browsers interpret this thing is top to bottom, left to right. So that whenever I put H1, you may have noticed it was in the top left, wasn't it? And I could change that, but that's the default mode. As the browser reads down the page, it's going to place the items in that same order, top to bottom, left to right. Okay. Oh, that did work. All right, I thought that wasn't going to work. Let's see if it made it a block element automatically. So I'm going to inspect, and it's even like hovering over, right? It looks pretty bad, but that's because I told it to go over there. So display is block. Interesting. And if I turn off the absolute position, you see it snaps back to where it would have been by default. Do you see that? I can toggle these on and off. This window that I'm toying with is called the developer tools, and you can get there by right-clicking on a web page and clicking inspect. Web developers love this set of tools, and it's particularly high quality in the Chrome browser. That's one of the reasons we love the Chrome browser, is the developer tools are really well made in the Chrome browser. Okay, and now the display is inline. So the kind of display is another CSS rule that the browser has picked by default. And now we're going to talk about block types. So a paragraph is like a block of text. That makes sense, right? And you can take a block and sort of move it around just like a div. A div, I could move it around because it's a block. You can think about it like a square or a piece of Tupperware or a piece of paper on this stack. Inline elements are not blocks. Inline are items inside of a list of text. So if I'm writing you a letter, just like you think with a span, it's a piece of a sentence. It is in line with the rest of the text. It's not really a square anything. If I shrink my page, the text will wrap around, and I want my word, what is my word? Still. I want my still to do that wrapping around. It will do that if we treat it as inline text. If we treat it as sort of an arbitrary square or box, it might not do that. It might just like kind of clip off the edge of the page or something. So these are the two main rendering modes, is that you have text-like objects, and then you have these block objects, which could be an image or a div or a whole paragraph. And the real distinction there is between the container and the stuff in the container. So like a paragraph and the text inside of it. Text inside of it will be inline. The container itself is a block. These are the two main ones. Now there are two other ones to be mindful of. There is flex and grid. So with flex, you can think that you have the Google square. So I have this Google square, right? Let me put it back where it was. I have this Google square, which we've been treating as sort of just a block or a piece of paper. But if I make it flex, it becomes stretchy. So let's do that. Display flex, okay? And now a flex item does not have a particular height and width. It can have a default height and width, but then when the user changes the page, it will just sort of squish. Instead of getting cut off, it will squish. That's what makes it flex. Does that make sense? And here goes this one being cut off. Of course, it's going to throw a wrench in my spiel here. So I think the problem is that the container is flex, but the image itself is still not flex. So let me delete this and put something else in this container. I can right click and edit as HTML. Let me use a paragraph. That will be, I think, easier to deal with. You know what? Let's just use the div itself. Never mind. It doesn't need to contain anything. The div itself can be just an arbitrary piece of the screen that maybe it has a particular color, say. And so let's say the background is blue and the width is 50%. Okay. And so this thing is just going to squish. Now, what if I said, I don't know if this would still squish if I said 500 pixels, or if it would be stuck there. I'm not sure. I genuinely can't tell you if it's squishing down or if it's cutting off the edge of the page. But I will tell you that we usually discourage fixed widths because it can lead to the clipping problem. So doing like a 50% here would be much more common. Right, and then flex wrapping is really nice because if I squish it, it might just pop down automatically. Let's see if I can demonstrate that for you. So let me go here 100%. All right, this will take up the whole thing, and then I'll give it two children, two items nested inside. So here I'll say div green, and then I'll make another div red, div red. Okay? And so this container is a flex. And what about these children? You see they are by default blocks. Divs are by default blocks. So I want to force it to be a flex. And then I want it to take up width of 50%. And background, this is the, which one is this? This is the green one. Okay? All right, that's the green one. And let's go do the red one. So display flex width 50%. And background is red. Interesting to note, sometimes there are multiple names for the same effect. So I could call this background or background color, and red will work either way. So background is more generic. You can put a color there or a whole image. Background color is specifically going to be a color. And you can see if I tick this down, the blue is going to peek out, right? So the parent is still back there. Now, they're 50-50, so they're perfectly covering it. But what happens if I go slightly over? The green is getting squished, isn't it? The green is getting squished, which is different than if I had made them blocks. Now, if you're at 120%, you can't exist inside of 100%. So I'm expecting them to wrap. Let's see. And now they wrapped, but I got rid of the height somehow. Anyway, do you see what I mean by wrapping? That the red one comes underneath now. Let's see if I go down. Then I can make it inline block. And it's only going to work if they're both inline block. And now they will sit next to each other. This is like an older way to make block. You can make blocks sit next to each other. This is like an older way of doing things. Today, you would generally use flex instead of inline block. But there's multiple ways to accomplish many of these things. Okay, so I think we've covered headings, paragraphs, all this stuff, nesting. We talked about the difference between the tag, its content, class ID, and then, yeah, we talked about all this. And then what about anchors? Anchors let us go to web pages. So A is for anchor, and it will have a hyper reference. And this could be google.com. Okay, and here I'll say click me. So here we have the open tag, which is an anchor type. The value just says click me, so what's going to be on the page is click me, right? And then we close it. And let's see what happens. Click me. I can click it, and it goes to, oh, this is not good. It thinks it's on my computer. What do? I should give it the full URL, including the HTTPS protocol, because when I'm on my computer, I'm actually using a different address protocol, which is the file address protocol. So I need to give this full thing to tell the browser, hey, Google's not on my computer. It's like out there on the internet. Okay, so let's go back, refresh, and now click it. And you see it changes my browser to Google. And so this is what anchor tags do, is they give you links. They give you links. I can also change the target. So target equals other or self. So here, when I clicked it, it changed this tab on my browser, right? But I might want it to open a new one. I think this is not the right target, but we'll see. Yeah, so it opened a new tab, but I think I used the wrong syntax. When writing an anchor tag, what target value indicates that the browser should use a new tab? Blank. So some browsers will treat any value other than self, like any other value, they will treat them as equivalent to blank. But the proper quote unquote way to do it is to use blank. And that will open a new tab. Now, why does that matter? Now I want you to start thinking in terms of the user experience. Put yourself in the shoes of the user and of the implications of some of these subtle changes on their behavior. So if I target self, this results in them leaving your website. Now they've left your website. It'll be much easier for them to like close this and forget about you. So user experience designers often prefer to target blank so that they can go do their thing in Google or whatever other website, external website, and then they'll come back and remember you, and they will continue their session and spend more time on your website. So do you see how the elements on the page and then the way they look? And of course you can imagine that like a button that's like a clickable button that maybe it sends you to go pay some money or something like that. If it's really bright and the text is large, you can change the visual elements to drive user behavior. Maybe they're more likely to click on it. Or if it's really ugly or hard to see, they're less likely to click on it. So when we think about professional engineers who are either front-end web developers or even designers, this is the higher level, higher order of thinking that we need to be thinking about, is the user-focused, like the user journey, and the changes that you're making. What is the behavior on the end user, the website user? Okay, one other thing that's interesting to note about anchors is that they can keep you on the same page and they can pop you around instead of popping you to another page. So here, let me make a really big paragraph. Here I'll use something called lorem ipsum. Lorem ipsum is like some filler text that's very commonly used in designs just to generate like fake text so that you can get a feel for how it looks visually, regardless of what the thing says. And so here I've got a big paragraph, and now I'll make a few of these. And now you see I need to scroll. So you see we're scrolling down now. And now let's say I have another heading down here, and this heading will be conclusion. So this is my conclusion section of my chapter or my book or whatever. It's way down there. It's below the fold. That means you cannot see it when the page initially loads. So the user is going to have to scroll to go see it. But maybe I don't want them to scroll. I want them to be able to, and maybe we'll have an appendix after the conclusion. And you can imagine like in a research paper, appendix A. In a research paper, we may want the ability to jump from a footnote like down to that appendix there. And then here I'll say, go to appendix A, okay? So now I have this go to appendix A. It doesn't quite work yet because the href is still pointing to Google and the target is blank. So here I want to stay on the same page. And I need to give this an ID. And we'll give this an ID of appendix A. And now I can tell the anchor link to jump there. And I forget if I need to put the hashtag in front of the word appendix. We'll see. Yeah, okay, so it's thinking there's a file called appendix. Let me do the hashtag. Yep. Okay. And so now look at my URL. It's the same web page, hash appendix A. And that's called an anchor link. It's jumping to a point where you have defined the anchor. And here the anchor, we're using an ID for the anchor. You can think about like when you have an anchor of discussion or something like that. I think that's a better mental model than the anchor of like a ship. So the idea of an anchor is like the thing that we're talking about. We're like anchoring on this idea. And I can click a link. And if I use this special hashtag syntax, remember what is syntax? Syntax is just a collection of letters that means something to the interpreter. And in this case, the anchor is using the hash syntax, which my Chrome browser knows that means, hey, don't go to some other file or some other page. It's on this page, wherever the element that has an ID called appendix A. And it doesn't need to be a heading. I could have put it on the paragraph or a span, or it's looking for the ID. Does that make sense? Okay. And I think that's pretty much the stuff that I wanted to, oh, let's talk about pseudo classes really quick. Here you can see this font style is different. That's the font family, size, italics, bold. We've talked about all that. Selectors, we talked about the period selector for the class name, the tag selector, ID selector, attribute selector. So we got those, but there's something called a pseudo element and a pseudo class. Here, we can have some limited interactivity, and I'll do this with the cookie recipe. Okay, so I'm going to my HTML file, Command F, Control V, enter. There's my cookie recipe. And here I want to say class hover on, or like underline on hover. And if you remember, our goal was like, let's do something like this Google page, and they have this underline on hover. So how do we do that? Oh, and it's making like the finger pointer. We'll do that too. So here's like an arrow cursor, and here it turns to like a finger, like clickable cursor. And technically that's called a cursor pointer. That is the style, the CSS style names is that this would be a cursor pointer. So the CSS property is the cursor, and the value is that this is the pointer as opposed to the ordinary cursor icon here. All right, so we've made underline on hover, and we're going to use the CSS class to go give us that effect that we wanted to see. Okay, so I'm going to use the period syntax, and I'm going to now text decoration, underline, and cursor pointer. So where are we at? Let me close some of these. And let me get rid of the absolute span that's like bothering me now. I can use CSS comments, by the way. And the text is still there, but it's getting ignored by the browser. So this is a comment syntax. It means ignore whatever we're about to do. And this would be useful, like if you are working on a team and you have some information like this attribute is used on all sales pages. You can imagine you might just want to share that information with other developers because maybe there is like one style file for this whole big website and they're like, I've never seen random banana. Like, what does random banana do? You just leave them a note. That's what comments are for. Really useful. Or even for myself, because I forget stuff. You know, the code I wrote last year or whatever. So here, the underline on hover, cookie recipe, I now have that cursor pointer and it's underlined, but it's not doing it on hover. It's doing it all the time. I just want it to do that on hover. So here's where I write :hover. And this is called a pseudo class. I didn't actually write a class called hover. It's like a thing that CSS already knows, modifies it. It's built into the language. Browsers already understand it. And it's not a class by itself. It always modifies some other class. That's what makes it a pseudo class. Okay? And so now it's not underlined, but when I hover, it underlines. Do you see that? So this is some of the interactivity that CSS can do. We can't do a lot of things. We can't do like big graph animations and stuff. We'll need JavaScript for that because you're going to need to go like get the data from the server. You're going to need to go across the network to get the data to even like draw the right graph. And then when the user does a thing, we need to know that they did a thing. Here we know that they hovered, but in the case of a graph, like let's say that you want, whenever they hover on the number 5, then a bar chart gets longer. Well, we don't know what number they hovered on. So we're going to need JavaScript for something like that. That will also use the hover action, but you'll have a JavaScript listener, not a pseudo class listener for the hover action. And then when someone hovers on something in JavaScript, you can actually go, okay, what's the number of the bar that they hovered over? And like, now let's make the thing longer. So you're going to need JavaScript for that sort of advanced interactivity. But for basic interactivity that is supported by CSS built-ins, like the hover, and then there's a couple other of these. You can do visited, specifically for links that people have already visited. We often show them in another color. So there's just a specific number of limited features that CSS can support with these built-in pseudo classes. And hover is one of them. I think it's probably the most important, frequently used one of them. Again, you don't need to memorize these. You can go to ChatGPT and say, list the most common pseudo classes and pseudo elements. And one of the cool things about this is that I haven't even spelled pseudo class correctly. Pseudo class should have a dash. So the technical way that you spell pseudo class is with a dash, but ChatGPT will understand me anyway. So one of the things that's really nice about ChatGPT over Google keywords, if you spell the keyword wrong, you're not going to get the right website results. With ChatGPT, it can kind of help you out even if you get the spelling wrong. So visited, active, that's a good one. Focus. So whenever I like double click on this text, I'm like focusing on it. Maybe I want to do something with like these highlighted ones. First child, like here I have a paragraph and this is the first child span of it. Let me make another child. So now there are 2 nested spans, and you could also call them children. When you have a nested element, we also call them children of the parent element or the element that's containing them. And so this first element or this first child would just bold the first span of any paragraph. And so they all have their use cases. And basically, if you can do something with CSS instead of writing out JavaScript code, it can be easier for you as a developer. It might also be faster for the browser to process it. So there's reasons that you might want to do stuff like this. So it's something to be aware of. But it's only supported by a limited set of functionality. And then there are pseudo elements. So just like a pseudo class is sort of like a built-in modifier to a class, a pseudo element is going to allow you to make a visual artifact like an HTML element, but you're making it in the CSS. And so let me give you an example of one of these. Selection is going to style what was selected. Let's see. These are just, yeah, before is a good one. So before every paragraph, I want to have, I don't know, a square. Like you might just want to have like a square icon for every, what would you do this realistically more? Maybe like in a book, if you have like headings, maybe you want like an icon before the heading. And so it's just like every heading before it, let's place this icon. I'm not going to do an icon because I'm just going to do something easier, but you could put an icon here if you wanted. It doesn't matter, right? I'll just do like 3 asterisks. And so you can see this is selecting all paragraphs and it's creating a pseudo element with a content of these asterisks. It's creating them before every paragraph. So let's refresh. Now you see all these. These are not in the HTML. I can't even select them because they're not really text. They are pseudo elements. and I've created them using my CSS file. It's really a visual artifact is what this kind of thing is for. Great. All right, let's talk about let's talk about VS Code, and then we'll basically be done and talk about the limitations of this course and things you might want to learn in the future. So VS Code is really cool. Visual Studio Code, also called VS Code. And here I can open a folder. I can open my workspace folder. And yeah, I'll trust the authors. That's fine. And here I open up some page. And notice how it already looks different. I have blue letters for the tag name, light blue for the class name, orange for the values, white for the inner text. So it's really easy to see, like, what's an HTML tag. If I'm looking for a certain HTML tag, I'll be able to find it easier. Okay, so this is called syntax highlighting. So this is one of the many features that an IDE is going to have. I can Command-Shift-P and say, oh, did that not work? Command-Shift-O, format. Here I've started a tag and it's given me these options. So maybe I say P. Oh, you can do a pre-tag, a picture tag, a param tag. So this is called autocomplete. It'll include spell check, and if I make a typo, it can sometimes fix it. So let's see if I do pro. Does it tell me that that's an error? I might need a plugin for that. You can also get plugins, and it would a plugin would go, pro isn't real. Did you mean pre? And I would go, oh yeah, a pre-tag. Autocomplete, formatting, linting, basically like figuring out if you wrote code errors. The IDE can do a lot of that for you automatically. I want to be able to format. Why can I not format? The terminal, earlier I had like the note. Yeah, there's like Notepad over here and the File Explorer over here, and then I had a terminal. You can do it all in one. That's why we call it an integrated development environment. It does all these things in one. So basically, oh, I can also jump to code. So I can hold the control key and click this, and it'll pop that file open. Here's some linting. My comment syntax was not correct. So I think in CSS, I should use a different syntax to indicate a comment. Now you see it's green. That means it's a code comment. So it's already helped me write higher quality code. Do not use an empty rule set. Yeah, so this is a linter. Linting is like either finding errors or finding things that are probably bad ideas. So like it's probably a bad idea to have code that doesn't do anything. So at that point, I should just remove it. So that's why it was giving me a yellow indicator saying like, do not use empty rule sets. These are some of the features of an IDE. I really want to see the formatting. Shift-Alt-F. Okay. You see how it changed? So here I have some spaces, and then in other places I don't. Like this paragraph. Let me mess this up on purpose so you can see this better. So you see how like it's inconsistent the way that I made this list and this list up here. So if there's a pattern in the code, it's harder for me to read because it's not formatted. If I right click and say format document, it fixes that. So it's more consistent between the ordered list and the unordered list. The paragraphs are more consistent. It's easier for me to read as a developer. Okay, so VS Code, you're going to want it, especially going into JavaScript. There are so many features that your integrated development environment will give you. This is just for like HTML and CSS, but getting into JavaScript, there's going to be even more. Semantic HTML, let's talk about this. We did talk about this a bit, right? So don't use a div when you should use a paragraph because div doesn't mean anything. So some programs that read your website are not people. Some programs that read your website are going to be like, what if you have a website user who's blind? then they will need to use an aid, which tells them what's going on. And if you use the wrong tags, you'll really confuse these people. So that's another thing to note. That has to do with accessibility. SEO and metadata, when I go to Google and when I look for banana, I get here like this title. So this title is coming from the HTML using something called a meta tag. So here I will have a meta my website. And this does not show up on the page, but robots can read it, and it will allow search engines to show the title. Otherwise, they might like assume the title based on a heading or something like that. So these sorts of tags are going to be something that you want to look into more, ask ChatGPT about it, especially if you're trying to do like ads or get high ranks for traffic in Google or whatever. There's all sorts of tools out there that will help you figure out like what is the optimal meta tag, meta description. So this information down here is your meta description. And you can use different versions of a meta tag and a meta description to try to match the keywords that users are searching for. And so there's other tools that will help you optimize your SEO by finding the best keywords or even the best sentences or whatever to use. And those will use a kind of HTML tag called a meta tag. So it's a tag that's giving information about the web page. That's why we call it meta. And these are a class of semantic tags. So semantic tag just means that when you use an HTML tag, it means something. So when I use a meta title, that means something. This is the title of my page. But again, when I use a div, it doesn't mean anything. It's just an arbitrary section of the screen. It's not meant to have any logical meaning to the end user or to like whether the end user is a human or a robot. Like it's not meant for informational purposes. You could also say that a span is not semantic. It does have a technical meaning, which is like part of a sentence, but you don't want the span to imply anything special. It doesn't communicate anything special. If I bold a section of the sentence, it's interesting to the end user because it's bold, not because it's a span. Does that make sense? The element itself is not doing anything in terms of meaning. It's just a technical functional utility to get a subsection of that sentence. It's not meant to have meaning in and of itself. Although it may enable style, and the style might imply some meaning, but the element itself is not meant to have any meaning. Unlike a heading, say, which is like, we pick the heading because it is a heading. Like that means something, even if you can't see the page. Maybe the tool that's helping the non-sighted user could say like title, like chapter title or whatever. So it actually has a meaning behind it. It's not purely for style purposes. And then sections. So a section is just another example of a semantic tag. Here we said appendix A. Maybe there is a section of like a group of paragraphs. The idea of a section is if you have a group of things but you want it to mean something, then use a section instead of a div, basically. And this could be like chemistry section. Like maybe your appendix has a chemistry section and a biology section. So you could do a biology section. You also might just make like a second appendix. But anyway, if you want to keep it in one appendix, that's one way to do it, to sort of break it up and say, hey, these paragraphs go together logically, like they are a meaningful group. Then it would be smarter to use a section instead of a div to that purpose. Good. Okay, so we talked about the search strategies. Also, hey, I've made this HTML page. How do I show it to anybody? Like, I'm not going to tell Bill, my dad or whatever, to go to File. This is all on my computer. If I want to deploy it somewhere like laterally, This is a remotely deployed website that's accessible to the open internet. That whole process is outside of HTML itself, and it's a process called deployment. So I'll recommend you check out this Trial by Fire 2.0. It's under 2 hours, and it will show you how to get a website deployed so you can start building a portfolio that you can send to people. And I think it also has a bit of JavaScript in there as well. We talked about HTML and CSS, but we didn't talk about dynamic. We talked about hover, but that's like super minor. The amount of things you can do with a website, like 3D websites where you're like have a user driving a car with their WASD keys or the arrow keys or honking when they click. You can do all of these things, and that requires JavaScript. So the combination of JavaScript and HTML to change the page in response to a user action, we call that dynamic HTML. This will include forms. So going back to Google, let me refresh the page. This looks kind of funky. When the user types in here and hits enter, I want the website to do something. I need JavaScript. So you can see that without JavaScript, your websites are really, really limited, and it is part of the basic toolbox of a developer, even an early career developer. You will be expected to know 3 technologies at a minimum: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So this course has been an overview of HTML and CSS. I think you're well prepared on the fundamentals, and if you do the search strategies, you'll be able to continuously learn through the rest of your career. But to build a full website, HTML and CSS are not enough. You're going to want to add JavaScript. And so forms, like this is a form. This is an element. It's a kind of element called an input. This one's called a text area. A text area is a kind of input. I could also just make it an input. And that means that the user is going to put some text in here. We just haven't covered it because you can't do anything with it without JavaScript. Like they can type, so what? Like I need the ability to send it somewhere before it's really even worth talking about. So you can see how these technologies are interleaved. We talked about how HTML and CSS go together because even when you pick an HTML element, there is a default CSS rule set that the browser will apply. So you're implicitly making a CSS decision. Whenever you start using forms, using a HTML form without JavaScript, it doesn't make sense. And similarly, so these technologies are going to interleave and relate to each other. Variables, you can have a variable CSS representation. We talked about like red. So using the word red, oh, by the way, color picker is another thing that VS Code IDE can do. So super cool, super useful. The word red is kind of like a name, but I could make a CSS variable which stands in for some color. Maybe it's a ridiculous color that doesn't have a name. And I could call this like special lime green. That's not how you write a CSS variable, but basically, so this is a pseudocode. This is like something like what I would do. It's not the literal code. It wouldn't actually work this way. You can see I'm getting a linter error here. It's like this is not a right way to do a variable. But basically in CSS, we have red, green, blue, some of like predefined color names. But what if I want to make one up? You can do that, and you can do that with a CSS variable. And it's not restricted to colors. I can give a name to like medium bold, heavy bold, and other CSS rules and values. I can make up variables for them. And I can even make up variable names for paragraphs. And that gets into templating, which is a technique we use in JavaScript. And if you continue on with the courses, which I encourage you to do, we will be talking about React. What does React do? React is a JavaScript library that basically allows you to make HTML pages. And you can make like lots and lots of really cool special pages with less work by using variables. And you can just imagine, like, if I have a variable for a page, now I don't need to go make a bunch of pages. I can just have this one variable and say like times 10. And now I got 10 pages and stuff like that. So that, like think about the idea of, instead of all these paragraphs, I could just do like one paragraph times 10. That's not going to work in HTML, but when you template HTML with JavaScript variables, you can basically do that. Media elements, like you go to YouTube, they have video players. That's a special, this is like a special HTML element. We haven't covered it, but it's pretty straightforward. You just, like, ask ChatGPT about it. You just need to be able to connect it to your video file. Same with audio player. Animations, we really haven't gotten into animations or gradients. So with gradients, you know, we talked about how to do the colors in the word Google. But I could actually let it fade. It could, so instead of being solid blue G, it could be light blue at the top, fade to dark blue at the bottom. That would be called a gradient. And you can do it vertically, sideways, diagonal. Pretty simple technique. Just ask ChatGPT how to write a gradient. I can even ask it now. Rewrite the sandwich spans from single colors into vertical gradients. And preprocessors. So this is a pretty small CSS file, but imagine that it was like 1,000 lines long. That would be not ideal. And so there's some there's ways that you can shrink that basically. So CSS preprocessors, we haven't really talked about. And we don't need to talk about it now. You'll get into this more when we get into React. Being able to write my CSS here is super useful. Like, what if, like, we talked about blog color, right? There are a bunch of CSS rules I could write, and it would be nice if the CSS was generated for me automatically without me having to like even go define it. Like, yeah, I could just say blog color, I don't know, green, and the CSS rule would go be written for me. That's one thing that a preprocessor can do. Interview preparedness. Okay, so you know the basics of HTML and CSS. Actually, if you have memorized the content of this kind of like lecture, then you probably will be prepared for HTML and CSS questions in an interview. But the typical interview for a front-end developer or a software engineer or a designer is going to include more than HTML and CSS. There's also other things that you can do, like basically anticipate the question. We haven't gone into like what are common interview questions. So I'll encourage you to intentionally study these. So Latterly's advice is learn to code and then intentionally study the job search and the interview techniques almost as an entirely distinct skill set. I wish it were the case that you could learn to code and then a job would fall into your lap. That's not how it is. You're going to need to social network, get your resume right, get your LinkedIn profile right. Even tone of voice and things like that. There's just like a lot of evidence-based tips that we can give that we haven't gotten into. And then browser differences. So here we've been mainly working with Chrome, modern versions of Chrome. If you need to support like old versions of Internet Explorer, which still happens in some cases, there are certain CSS rules that you can and can't use. You're going to want to be able to like tell ChatGPT, hey, I'm specifically using this browser version and I need to ensure support. Here you can see, let's see if I can get some predictive text to show some of these. Yeah, so Moz any link. MOZ is a browser specifier. So it's like some browsers will have newer features as well that are specifically working in that browser. And so you might need to use some of these browser specifiers. I would generally encourage you to stay away from them, by the way. So like experimental features, and I have an asterisk on it for that reason. Like you don't need this stuff to land a job. You don't need to know experimental new features or legacy Internet Explorer rules. You don't need to know that to get a job. It's once you get on a job, you might find yourself in a situation where you run into that. and just be prepared to learn it just in time. And so again, lean on those search strategies. The search strategies won't enable you to learn anything. Here we've gotten enough that you'll be able to build out a portfolio, land a job, and then you're going to continue learning on the job is the idea here. So the mental model is sufficiency over mastery. We want to equip you to get a job or to build a thing. If you want to build your own website, we want to equip you to do enough. The idea that you need to master or memorize all aspects of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, web development, Bash, Git, GitHub, DevOps, security, hacking, you don't need to know all that stuff. You need to know enough to get a job and then adopt a continuous learning mindset throughout your career and also maintain a healthy lifestyle. That will be another thing that's covered out of this course, but dealing with things like burnout, sleep enough, hydrate, be healthy, because we want to set you up for long-term career and life success. So that's it. So feedback is welcome. You can drop a comment on any of the social channels. Not John's Linktree has a bunch of social links here, and then you can also go to the Latterly Discord under the community tab and drop a comment there at any point in time. Thank you so much for being here. And let's see if I have any comments in the chat that I want to quickly deal with. Coder Enjoyer says HTML and CSS is not a programming language. Yeah, I think I dealt with that earlier. So it's not Turing complete programming language. It is a DSL, which is a kind of programming language. Pratik says, been so used to VS Code that even HTML seems hard on a notepad. Yeah, once you get used to the features of an IDE, like you're never going to want to go back to this notepad stuff. So install it. I hope you'll check out how to do JavaScript next, and that will be absolute. So the trial by fire is also going to teach you how to install VS Code. It's not much to it. You just go VS Code and you go install it for your platform, whether you're on Windows or